Hello, everyone, and welcome to our World Rhino Day celebration, continuing celebrating World Rhino Day. My name is Azi Sharif. I'm the founder and executive director at Wildlife Jewels, and I'm so excited for today. It is a great pleasure to have you all here at this event, at our panel discussion. The theme for our panel today is Uniting for Collaborative Transformative Solutions to Protect Rhinos from Poaching. I truly hope that this event inspires you to come up with innovative ways to take actions, innovative ideas, partnership ideas, whether it's technology ideas, to come up with strategies to save our precious rhinos from poachers. And our agenda today will start with a short introduction, and we have our distinguished speakers where they'll be presenting their incredible work and inspiring stories and visions and models. Then we'll have a panel Q&A session, and then Mike, one of our distinguished speakers, will be moderating our Q&A session for the audience, and then we'll have a closing remark. The objective of our panel is to spark new game-changing ideas, partnerships, and collaborative initiatives across multiple disciplines and diverse entities in order to protect our precious rhinos from poachers. Now, a bit about myself and Wildlife Jewels. Wildlife Jewels is a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting wildlife from human-caused threats through a fusion of science, technology, art, and multidisciplinary collaboration, with big focus areas and passion for fighting wildlife crime, enhancing wildlife rescue and initiatives to protect wildlife during during crises, and ocean conservation. And my background, both educational and professional, has been through the fusion of fine arts and technology, robotics, all inspired by wildlife, and also technology transition and science and technology evaluation as well. And I'm truly passionate, as I mentioned earlier, to really the collaboration, the collaborative effort coming together to fight the wildlife crisis and to rhino poaching. Poaching crisis is a war. Rhinos are being brutally attacked for their horns by coordinated criminals. These are not just individuals. They have access to advanced technologies. They can even get into the technologies that the speakers that you hear, that the individuals that are working to protect the rhinos, they can even get into those technologies. So we're talking about truly criminals. We need technologists, scientists, lawyers, policymakers, governments, and organizations across multiple sectors and entities to unite and come up with game-changing transformational ideas and actions to protect rhinos from extinction. And it's not just all the rhinos from extinction, even one rhino, any rhino. We need to save rhinos, and we need to save wildlife. Today, we'll explore collaborative solutions, we'll explore ideas, we'll get inspired to save rhinos. And I'm so honored. I'd like to introduce our distinguished speakers for today that will be discussing their incredible ideas and the works they've done, their models, their visions. Dr. Fowlds, world-renowned wildlife veterinarian from South Africa. Mr. Mike Veale, president of Global Conservation Force, and Mr. Ralph Chami, co-founder of Blue Green Future and Rebalance Earth. Our first speaker today is Dr. Fowlds. Dr. Fowlds is a world-renowned wildlife veterinarian in South Africa, a passion and a calling from his childhood days spent in the wild African bush of the Eastern Cape. Welcome, Dr. Fowlds. Wonderful to have you here.
Thank you very much, Azi. Appreciate the invitation, and I'm very honored to be able to join you this evening. I'm just going to share my screen quickly if you don't mind. Give me a second. And then we should be on track. Right, I'm assuming you can see that. So just a very short sort of cross-section of some of the things that we have to deal with on the ground. I love using the story of Thandi, and people forget there were 2 other rhino involved in the story. Sadly, the other 2 died in the process of being poached or recovering from their wounds. But what this single rhino has done, Thandi, she's allowed us to break through a lot of the media barriers that prevent the brutality of poaching, that the raw suffering and brutality of poaching from getting into the media. And the reason why she's allowed us to do that is because she has fought her way to recovery, and in doing that, gone on to have multiple babies. And that happy ending story has allowed us to take the reality of what rhino go through at the hands of poaching, one of many species, by the way, and get it into mainstream media, get it into social media, and make it just palatable enough that people actually can grit through the raw pain and suffering that she tells really well. A phenomenal animal. So just to kick off her story quickly, 2nd of March 2012, so we're going back nearly a decade. Guests on a game drive, on a game reserve, on their safari on Kariga Game Reserve, came across these harrowing images of a bull lying dead. We called him bull number 84 because he was the 84th one poached that year in South Africa. Thandi, who was still alive when they found her like this. And then there was a second survivor called Temba. And all 3 of these animals were poached within a few hundred meters of each other by a gang that was incredibly effective. In fact, it took us 6 years to catch this gang. It took us another 3 years in court to get them convicted. It took us a further 2 years to fend off their appeals before their sentencing finally stuck. So that is a whole nother story in itself. But this is the beginning of Thandi's story. We found her and Temba in an incredibly desperate situation. Their faces had been hacked off, and they were literally left to die like so many rhino are. And this is an almost daily occurrence in South Africa. Like I say, one of many species that suffer at the hands of the illegal wildlife trade. But it's very seldom that we actually get to them while they're still alive. And most of the suffering happens unseen, and these rhino die somewhere in the African wilderness, and their stories never get to be told. So it's been an honor, I suppose, in a way, to share her story, but also the impact that she's had on our lives and how that's driven our quest to try and keep these animals safer into the future. So this is day 1 for Thandi. She'd lost an enormous amount of blood. We weren't sure if she was going to make it, but our determination to try started on this day with her. Just some mechanical representations of what these poachers did. So they try and remove all the keratin from their faces, and in doing so, particularly if rhino are still alive when they are hacked, they cut very deep into their skulls. So in this case, this wound is about 2 inches below the bottom of her horn, and it's gone through her skull and into the sinuses that make up the sort of breathing and temperature regulation apparatus of a rhino's head. So incredible brutality, massive pain, blood loss, suffering, and shock is the state that we find these animals in. We then set about a successive number of procedures out in the wild, which was very difficult for us, but extremely stressful for them. And all this time, not knowing whether her or the bull Temba were actually going to make it, and whether all this additional pain and suffering was going to be worth their while. lots of complications of dealing with open wounds out in a wilderness area, including infection and maggot complications. But already in those early days, I think this was the start of active collaboration, not just the game reserve, Kariega Game Reserve, on which this took place, but as we began to share their story, we received help from all over the planet, literally. And those previous images I've shown you of the skull came from a lab in Ohio who literally scanned a frozen rhino head for us and told us what was going on inside. We didn't have that knowledge when we began this process. We brought in the expert assistance of 2 vets. One is an equine veterinarian, because there isn't such a thing as a specialist rhino surgeon. Horses are the closest species. We brought in a fascio-maxillary surgeon, and then we also brought in a human plastic surgeon onto the team. I have a cat visiting, excuse the meowing. So day 3, things were really looking bad. Obviously, these animals were dealing with all the internal complications of the poaching wounds and the subsequent shock that had obviously lasted for a couple of days. We began cleaning up their faces by removing excess tissue, trying to control the infection and the maggots as best we could, and applying the best medication we knew of in those days to see if we could encourage the healing. And yeah, from a healing perspective, just more than a month later, we saw a spectacular recovery in Thandi. This is how her face granulated and how this hole filled up as she started to heal. So that was phenomenal. It really gave us an incredible boost. But the sad reality of those first 30 days is that 24 days in, we lost Temba. And he died because while he was lying there before we actually began treating him, the pressure on his back leg caused that leg to die. The blood supply was constricted and those muscles literally died. So the internal damage on day 1 is what caught up with him, and sadly he died from complications relating to those injuries. Probably the worst day of my life, because we had to accept failure, and we had to accept that we had put him through an additional 24 days of suffering that did not produce anything that was beneficial to him. What it did do for us, though, is it taught us a lot about treating wounds in the wild, and specifically poaching-related wounds. And then as the months went on, Thandi showed this incredible resilience in healing and sort of reintegrating back into a crash. This is her face as it slowly pieced together. You'll see some keratin starting to form there on her back horn. We had many challenges surgically and in managing a rhino, one of them being you can't tell them not to rub their faces. So that's something that we've since innovated other solutions for, but back then we didn't have an answer to that. And eventually she started to turn into this beautiful rhino once again, although she'll never regrow her front horn. Today she has got back to something resembling what she used to look like, in that her back horn is almost grown to where it was before, and she's got this scar on her front horn that reminds us not only of their suffering, but this incredibly tenacious character and rhino that taught us a lot about resilience and fighting against all odds to overcome, and that has been an inspirational story, not only for me, but many people who have heard and come to see Thandi. And I know Veale, who's on the panel tonight, is one of those people too. I'm going to just flick back one slide. I often get asked by people, does Thandi feel anything or recognize me or anyone of the team for what we did for her? Unfortunately, being the vet, I'm the bad guy. So every time I had something to do with Thandi, we were stressing her out, we were chasing her with the helicopter, we were darting her, and I think subjecting her to to pain that she wouldn't have understood as being a positive thing. But the gentleman that you see closest to her there in the front of the game viewer, his name is Jason. He used to spend every day with her, watching and monitoring her and giving us feedback on her and Temba's progress. And on this day, this was at 20 months after the poaching. It was the only time I actually was out there with her and Jason. And she came right up to the vehicle, literally looked Jason in the eye as he was sitting there, and her nose just began to stream. And it's the only time I can say I've seen any physical manifestation of a rhino's emotional state. We know they don't cry like we do, but yeah, there was something that happened there, and that was a special moment for me. Right, we're going to end there for my presentation, and we'll obviously follow up during the Q&A.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fowlds. Such an just horrific act that is done to, it's just, I'm speechless. And just the incredible work that you and your team have done to save Tandy. And now she is grown. She has 5 calves of her own and also a grand calf. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mr. Mike Veale, President of Global Conservation Force. Mike is a Southern California native who has worked extensively with animals for the majority of his conservation career. Mike is the founder of and president of Global Conservation Force, a wildlife protection and conservation organization focused on rhino, elephant, pangolin, giraffe, and painted dog habitats and poaching crisis zones. Global Conservation Force is dedicated to saving wildlife from extinction through education, anti-poaching conservation efforts. Welcome, Mike. A pleasure to have you here.
Hi, Azi. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel with everyone today. I've had the pleasure to work with Dr. Fowlds on many occasions, so we do work regularly together, so it's fun to join on the conservation panel as well. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the bigger strategies that we utilize as a nonprofit in the realm of wildlife protection. So many people get focused on a single solution for all of these large problems that we're facing, specifically in conservation. So rhino poaching is very complex. So to combat the issues, that also has to be complex. We can't rely on a single silver bullet method. Many times we get honest comments and opinions about things with the best intent, but we can promise everybody if there was something that was working like a magic cure, we'd be utilizing already. The one key magic ingredient is in this calculation is people and collaboration. If we were to be utilizing the topmost skill sets of all experts in all areas and have access to the right funding, a lot of these things like rhino poaching are easy to tackle despite the scale of the complexity of everything. So myself, I work as a instructor for rangers. I work on patrol as a ranger, a canine handler as well. And then we work in counter wildlife trafficking investigations. We have a myriad of different programs that range from education in local communities to education programs abroad, ranger training programs that facilitate a standard set of training and operation within an area, all the way up to regional standardizing of training, which would be like the Eastern Cape, where we work with over a dozen reserves, law enforcement, national parks, private game reserves, and we've standardized our approach in working with everyone so that everyone is coming to the puzzle with the right piece, and no one's double dipping in funding or oversaturating a certain aspect of the conservation process. So it's a very important aspect within specifically wildlife protection, because there are a million things that you could do and not all of those things will work. In particular, a lot of time and effort is given to the technology first, and that does help, but without trained rangers on the ground, you have no way to implement the front side of that technology and then the reaction side of that technology and what it's finding. So again, coming back to the human element of conservation, putting well-trained rangers that are properly equipped into these wildlife habitats and sustaining those jobs stabilizes one aspect of the connection from community to conservation. And once we stabilize the value between the community becoming the input to those conservation jobs, so local community members becoming rangers and biologists and field guides, the tether and the communication between the industry is no longer separated from the world of conservation and the world just outside the fence line. And once we have these rangers trained, then we need to get these rangers in the mindset of we are all in the same team, we are all facing the same issue. Within the industry in general, it is hyper political for many reasons, the biggest one being the lack of resources. So a lot of people have a hard time collaborating or partnering with other organizations or entities. So one of our big things as GCF is we kind of act as the Switzerland between different reserves, where we are working as a neutral party, but training everybody up and eventually getting teams to work together, train together, and operate on a much bigger playing field. So you go from an individual reserve, which basically becomes an island nation in a scale of an effort so big, to a team that's within multiple teams in an entire region, communicating, networking, collaborating, training, operating together. Again, coming back to the human element, and this includes those education programs, conservation programs like wildlife relocation, collaring programs, fence lines, implementation of new tech that is used for monitoring for ecology, biology, and wildlife protection, and getting more outside experts in who can help fine-tune the specifics of the specific area. Another thing within the rhino poaching based problem, no two zones are exactly the same for what they're dealing with, but there are a lot of general commonalities. So in Southern Africa, we're not dealing with armed militias that are just bombarding, coming in with mounted machine guns on the back of trucks. We're dealing with very subversive, syndicate level infiltrations into police, magistrates, local communities, gangs working with other gangs, transnational syndicates from other countries coming in and providing money, weapons, you name it. So we need to be just as organized if we're going to be combating the level of organization that those against rhinos are already utilizing. In the same space for wildlife protection and conservation, coming back to the human and tech realm, one of the biggest challenges is funding, because many of the tech platforms that are available to the world right now in the public sector are easily outpriced for the conservation sector. So finding the bridge between partnerships with these companies, developments for the specific environments and needs of the conservation realm, as well as the real life changes that you need to work through on the ground, all of these things have to come into play while we are working with all the different factors of conservation, from wildlife conservation, community engagement, wildlife protection. Again, this is not an easy process. It takes a lot of us having to be very open, flexible, and adaptable to whatever comes our way. Almost the beggars not chooser type mentality, because we do need to utilize whatever we can. So that does come with a lot of modifications and revisits and readaptation. So again, in the GCF realm, we work in multiple reserves, multiple countries, multiple key species, habitats, and we focus on the specific threat and risk of that area, what we can utilize from that area, and then integrate it into this big formula that we have moving about. And one of the biggest things that's probably the most exciting is we've made a lot of progress collectively with our partners on the ground in many areas, but the Eastern Cape stands to be probably the most successful out of all those areas. You take a large area, you have many experts working together, many reserves working together, all the anti-poaching units working together, a lot of standardized training. A lot of us have our hubs and bases down there, and so we're seeing the progress we need to see. but it's not a time to give up because these things come in waves and the syndicates are always changing their game. So we always have to try to be ahead of them wherever we can. And that includes the fundraising aspect of what we're doing. So Azi, with that, I will go ahead and stop my particular presentation. That way we can move on to Ralph, and then we can save time for the Q&A at the end.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. Excellent. Very nice and informative presentation, and such just incredible, brave, and invaluable work that you and your team do to save and protect, ensure the safety of our beautiful rhinos. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Azi.
And now I would like to welcome our next speaker, Mr. Ralph Chami. Ralph is a financial economist and the co-founder of Blue Green Future and Rebalance Earth. He retired from the International Monetary Fund after 25 years, where he most recently worked as an assistant director. He has developed a novel way to tackle both climate change and biodiversity loss, namely to reposition flora, blue and green, and animal species, such as whales and elephants, as crucial allies in the quest to sequester carbon, secure climate-resilient ecosystems, help stabilize people on their land, and generate employment and income for local communities. Welcome, Ralph. Thank you so much for joining us. We're honored to have you here. So nice to
Hi, Azi. The honor is all mine. I'm so glad to be on this panel and to explore how I may be, of what we do, may be of help to this valiant effort to save the rhinos. I have to admit from the start that I know very little about rhinos. I've learned from working with scientists quite a bit about forest elephants and whales, but we'll see whether what I will present can be of help in the effort that both Dr. Fowlds and Mike are involved in. So if you please allow me to share my screen just to show you what my proposition would be, and whether it would make any sense in this context. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so Mike was talking about funding issues, and most of conservation relies on philanthropic money or sources from philanthropy, or people that are sort of altruistic and so forth. But we also know that nature, be it fauna or flora, is not getting enough funding to protect what we have, let alone to regain what we've lost. And in fact, the latest estimates that we have on how much is needed just to protect what we have is in the realm of a few $100 billion a year. That's the financing gap that is over and above what we really generate from philanthropy and from government funding. So I come in terms of, can we make a proposition to the private sector to help come in and invest? The word I use is invest in the protection and rejuvenation of our fauna and flora. So that's what I want to, that's where I come in. Can we make a value proposition such that on top of philanthropy and everything else, we generate funding from the private sector? Now, my story starts with in 2019 when I got a phone call from elephant scientist Fabio Berzaghi, who had published in a Nature journal with his colleagues that the forest elephants in the Congo Basin help to sequester carbon in the forest between 7 and 14%. Through the way I'll explain in a minute, and he called me in a panic because he said, "Listen, I just read your paper about valuation of this carbon services of the whales, and why did you do that?" I said, "Well, to protect the whales. The scientists were telling me what's happening to the whales, and I thought if I generated a value for their services, not for the whale, but for one of their services of the whale, perhaps the world would pay attention." And he said, "Well, their cousins on land, the forest elephants in the Congo Basin, do something very similar. They're forest engineers. And so he started to teach me about what do these elephants like to eat. And he said, well, elephants in the forest like to eat plants with low fiber and therefore high in protein. And what they leave alone are plants that are high in fiber and are therefore high in carbon. So by their taste buds, they're just like ours, they like to eat plants that have high protein content and therefore low fiber content. And so also through the way they walk around, how they fertilize the forest, what they eat, what they defecate, he referred to them as forest engineers. And this is all from his work with his colleagues 2019. And then he followed it with further work showing that the elephants, they're really engineers because of the way they disperse the seeds, they fertilize, they engineer the forest through how they traipse on small shoots, giving more space for older shoots which have more carbon content in them. All of this is to say that all of that work leads to a delta in the carbon sequestration in the trees above soil. He did not look at below soil, between 7 and 14%. And now further studies have confirmed his earlier findings. So then he asked me, well, Ralph, can you value that service? You did that for the whales. Can you do it for the elephants? And the reason is, I said, yes, I can. And he said, how would you be able to put a price on that? I said, well, there's a market for carbon. There's a whole world out there that has made a commitment at the Paris Agreement, in the Paris Agreement 2015, to go carbon zero or carbon negative or carbon neutral by 2050. And from me as a financial economist, that means there's a demand for some machine, or preferably a natural machine, or what a friend of mine calls Earth Tech approach to grabbing that carbon from the atmosphere. So the world made commitments, and now we have companies that have made commitments to go carbon zero, carbon negative, carbon neutral, and that's generate demand for someone, some entity, something that can grab all that carbon. So if you're telling me, this is a conversation with Fabio, if you're telling me that the elephants help to sequester carbon in the forest between 7 and 14%, then maybe I can, if you show me how the growth rate, of the population and the birth rate, death rate, we can build a population growth model. I can then build, with my colleagues, can build the mathematical model that simulates their lifetime and how much carbon is being sequestered in the forest over the lifespan of the elephant. And then once I have that, I can calculate the value of the elephant service. And this is what we did. This is the paper that a version of it ended up in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, where we showed all of the mathematics, and we did it for all of the Congo Basin. And then we followed it with another paper in Nature Journal showing that if you have an elephant, forest elephant, these are not the savanna elephants because we didn't have the science of that. And if you track the flow of carbon through her lifetime, let's say she lives 60 years, it may be male or female. If she is of age, certain age, she can give birth. Some survive, don't survive. You figure the population growth model, you can then figure out, keeping track of the overlapping generations, how much carbon is being sequestered over time. And then you figure out take a price of carbon. We took, I think at the time, we took a price of $20. The price of carbon today is over $100. And we did the present value, discounted present value of the lifetime flow of carbon for a single elephant, and it was $1.75 million. Of course, that number now is at least 4 times that much in light of the price of. So then the question becomes, okay, so the science is telling us, at least in the case of the elephants, that elephants are great allies in the fight against climate change. Suddenly, the non-scientists, the people that are not involved in conservation, people like me in financial markets and private sector, suddenly, wait a minute, there's a real life animal that can actually help sequester carbon, that can be an ally in the fight against climate? And the answer is yes. Wow. So even if I don't care for the rhino or for the elephant or the whale, but that whale, that elephant is doing something to keep me alive. And the answer is yes. Oh, fantastic. So you're generating another motive, you see, for being interested in the elephant beyond altruism, beyond conservation. It says, oh, so they're keeping me alive. How much is their service worth? Meaning, let's put it the other way around. If the elephant, because I was working on the elephant at the time, could speak, she would say, listen, I'm keeping you alive, and that service is not free. So how about if you pay me? So what would be her salary? By the way, her salary would be about, in those days, would be about $60,000 a year. Just, okay, and then you can calculate the lifetime earnings for her. So, but then so the science was telling us how valuable they are, we could do the valuation. Then people came to me and says, okay, so what do we do with that valuation? So this is a conversation I had over a number of years with Professor Lee White. At the time, he was the Minister of the Forests and Water and so forth. So, and he's an expert on elephants. And all of this is in our paper. But this is just an example that if at the time when we were looking at Gabon, from what we could tell from public data, that they had 57,000 elephants, and they were spread over 19 protective forests, and those 57,000 elephants, they could go back to what they would have been before any harm was done to them way back, was probably 150,000 elephants. So if we were to do that, then here's what you're really talking about. So the current stock of elephants, for using carbon pricing of, I think, of $20, are worth at least $12 billion. Now, this is just to give you a value of what you have, but the carbon markets, because I was making a proposition about the carbon markets don't work on stock, they work on flow. So if you can show that the stock of elephants, or if we want to go directly into the rhino world, if you can show that that stock of rhino is under threat, you can then, what is called in the Red Plus, called additionality. In the case of Gabon, that additionality would add another $11 billion. But actually here, $20 billion for the additionality, going from 57,000 elephants to 150,000 elephants. So basically what Gabon would be looking at, about $33 billion in terms of the value of the elephant, from what they have to what they could have in restoring the herd, and the income per year would be close to $950 million a year. Now, the question is, well, how would you make this, how would it work? Well, the first question we had to deal with, which is, who can speak on behalf of the elephants? And that would apply for the rhinos, okay? And I wanted to give you a number of ideas here, because I know, for example, in Costa Rica, they confer personhood on bees. In Panama, they confer personhood on sea turtles. I'm working with the Mari people of the South Pacific, and they are pushing to confer personhood on the whale. So that's one way. Why is that important? Because to talk to the markets, the first thing that the market people are going to ask, remember, they're not thinking of philanthropy, they're not thinking of altruism, they're thinking of value proposition. They're going to say, who owns, let's say, the elephant or the whale or the rhino, or is the rhino or the whale or the elephant, are they a person? Why is that important? Because suddenly, when you have a value and you have personhood, or you resolve the issue of personhood or ownership, then it becomes really a recognized asset. And the values that asset would generate would end up on the balance sheet. That's when the markets really take you seriously. So I'm giving you here different options. You could talk about legal rights of the rhinos. You could confer personhood on them, or you could say they're the assets of the indigenous people or the country in which they reside. If we were to do that, then suddenly the markets, here's how the market would work. Let's talk about the buyers. The buyers could be Microsoft, Google, Walmart, all these companies that want to reduce their carbon footprint. So they are buying, okay, the carbon services in this case, but we could talk about other kinds of services from, let's say, the Rhino. I really don't know if the Rhinos help to sequester carbon. I suspect that they do, but I don't know. But, or some other services that the Rhinos can provide. So the buyers are companies, could be governments, could be companies, could be individuals that want to reduce their carbon footprint. And what they're really buying are the services. Okay, so they pay money for the services. You never sell the Rhino, you never sell the elephant or the seagrass or the salt marsh or the trees. You maintain the ownership, or if they're personhood, they retain their freedom. But what you're doing, you're selling the services that they provide. This is how, and the money would go to look after, I just put the Rhino here. We were doing it for the elephant. The money would go to look after the elephants in perpetuity. And the money would go to look after the stewards of nature in perpetuity. This would be the local communities and the indigenous people. Now, typically what we face when we talk to companies, especially when we're talking about Gabon and investing in the elephants in Gabon, the potential buyer would always say, how do I know what's happening to the elephants or to the rhinos or whichever fauna we're talking about? So we need sensors, we need some kind of technology. We need what Mike is talking about. We need the guards that are the ones who are going to verify that the money that's coming, that these rhinos are still alive and doing well, so that whoever is investing in them could actually feel okay, confident that this isn't happening. All the contracts would enter on a blockchain, because we need to, when you talk to market people, they are always big on, we need transparency, we need traceability, we need to know where the money is going, who's receiving the money. Of course, from the other side, if it's the local communities and that are in charge of the rhinos or the elephants or whatever it is, they need to know who's on the other side of the contract to make sure that they're getting the money and everything is on the up and up. But keep in mind, if it is, let's say, in the case of the elephants, this was the proposition to Lee at the time, that really what the companies are doing, they're not just buying carbon, because when you're protecting the elephants, you are protecting the forest, because everybody knows when you have healthy elephants, you have healthy forests. So you're getting not only carbon credits, you're getting biodiversity credits. And when you create resilience in nature, you stabilize people in their land. So there's a social component to this. You're generating employment, because you're going to have to hire people to monitor what's happening to the animals and so forth. And you're alleviating poverty. So what Microsoft, if they're the purchaser, if they're the buyer on the left-hand side, they would be getting not only carbon credits, they're getting biodiversity credits, they're getting culture credits, and they're meeting and they're enhancing the ESG scores, but they're also getting SDGs 1, 3, 8, 13, 14, 15, actually, you can go all the way to 17. This is how this market would actually work. Unfortunately, in Gabon, we didn't continue, but we are doing this in the case of the elephant, in case of the whales, in our work with the Mari people in the South Pacific. I just want to tell you that when you do something like that, the beauty of it, everybody is a winner. Whoever is selling the carbon or biodiversity credits is getting that income. That income does not depend on tourists, does not depend on business cycles. It's because you're talking about nature markets. Nature markets are long-lived and they are not cyclical. So they are not affected by business cycles. God forbid there's another COVID, tourists don't come, doesn't really matter. You still need your carbon credits and biodiversity credits. So it helps, if it's the government that is in charge, it helps to diversify the economy. It's generating another source of revenue for the sellers. Now, for the buyers, it's just, again, repeating what I said before. If I'm Microsoft, Google, whatever you want to call it, Amazon, and I want to reduce my carbon footprint, how wonderful it is that your money is going not only to reduce your footprint by getting the carbon credits, but you're also you're looking after nature and looking after people. So you're talking about your SDGs 1384, 1348, 10, 13, 14, 15, actually all the way to 17. Who else benefits? By definition, because the money is coming in to look after nature. So in a sense, nature is benefiting from it. And we all know when we create resilience in nature, we create resilience in the people, which is incredibly important. So in this paradigm, no one is a loser. Everybody is a winner. Everybody gets something. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Absolutely brilliant. I just cannot wait to see the implementation of your model and to see the value, the legal rights of our animals, and to see it at a global scale. Thank you. And now we'll go ahead and start our panel discussion. Thank you, panelists, all for being here. We'll start with some questions that I will ask you, and then we'll be open to audience Q&A as well. Now, my first question here that I have is for Dr. Fowlds. It's in regard to the reserves. Rhinos are even facing threats within the reserves that they're supposed to be protected in. What urgent steps do you think organizations, individuals, and governments even should take to enhance the protection of rhinos in these areas? What is missing? What would really, really help to make a big difference, to make game-changing difference, to even help rhinos within the areas that they're supposed to be protected in? What critical resources are necessary? What is lacking?
I think his mute is stuck. He's going to need the moderator unmute. Here we go.
Yeah, thanks, Azi. I'm back. Thank you for that question. As Mike alluded to, this is an extremely complicated issue. Rhino poaching does not exist in isolation. There are political issues, there are socioeconomic issues, there is obviously a global environmental crisis, and rhino is just one species. So multidimensional. I think if we break it up into different sectors, so let's start with government, and I'm really talking about South African government. When I say this, I believe that where you have political will, poaching would stop. I also believe that if you have a strong law enforcement system at a national level, you will stop poaching. That has been proven in one or two examples across Africa. But political will and with that, the lack of corruption in government departments is a critical thing that needs to be fixed for many reasons. But yeah, poaching is a very good environmental example of that. The rest of us, call it non-governmental, from citizens to organizations to industry and corporates. If you look back in history, I think you will acknowledge that our environment is cared for and looked after by a very small percentage of humans. And it's simply not enough. There's just not enough people that are able to dedicate their lives and sustain themselves and pay for everything. So species like rhino have quite literally, in the absence of strong governance, they've literally become charity cases. And I think, this is what Ralph has alluded to very strongly. It's not sustainable for us to depend entirely on philanthropy and charity for their existence. When you're in a crisis like we are in, the philanthropy is an essential stopgap, but we've got to use that philanthropic assistance very carefully to try and use it to catalyze more sustainable solutions. So when you have a species like rhino that are facing extinction, as they have done, the trajectory over the last 10 years has been frightening. You really have to stop it. You've got to halt the crisis, and unfortunately that does mean a strong security presence on the front line. but we know that that costs a lot. It's not sustainable. It's often very antagonistic to local populations. And so then if you are able to do that, it gives you some breathing space to tackle the bigger issues, the socioeconomics, which is employment, local economies, the demand reduction side, on the market side of whoever's trying to buy these products. And then to get the collaboration going amongst a variety of stakeholders who are involved here. And that is a complicated process, and it takes time. And it takes an enormous amount of funding. So, you know, that's the scrum that we are all in at the moment. Amongst all of that, I think there are some incredible people that have come to our aid. I see some names on the participants tonight who are lifelong contributors to our cause, and we are very grateful for that. I do believe that it is possible to stop poaching, and we have shown that for multiple years in the Eastern Cape. And when we've lost animals, there have been very good reasons for that. But we are under no illusion we haven't solved the problem, because that does need innovation at every level. I don't think we're going to see it in political will fast enough to save a species like rhino. I don't think we're going to see it in demand reduction fast enough to save the rhino. I don't think we're going to see a socioeconomic turnaround that is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years in this country. So, you know, now we've got to be innovative. We've got to look for solutions to cater for twice as many people in Africa by 2050. And so technology, I believe, is going to be a temporary game changer. And why I say that is because it's moving faster than most of those other sectors that I've explained to you, and it's getting cheaper as it gets better. So that's a good thing. But to drive technology and to make it effective, the only way you can do that is through collaboration on the ground. And then simultaneous to all of that, you know, we mustn't get too boxed into the rhino crisis as a standalone entity. We have to rewild. We have to conserve all those species out there. Funding is by far our most challenging aspect of protection and restoration of wildlife. So those economic funding tools that Rolf has alluded to, those payment for ecosystem services, I see that as a mechanism to share the load across citizens, right, you know, global citizens, as opposed to that small percentage of wildlife custodians carrying all the weight with some assistance from tourism. People on the planet to contribute to the recovery of the planet, rhino, elephants, whales, and other habitats. And so those funding models will be critical.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fowlds. Invaluable, absolutely incredible insights that you've provided. It's not something that can be solved now or within a specific technology or within a partnership. It is just such a complex system that is going on, and we really need to think ahead of the game, to bring together the right partnerships to be able to fight the poaching crisis. Thank you, Dr. Fowlds. And you mentioned technology also. Now my next question is for Mike. How does technology, particularly advanced artificial intelligence, contribute to rhino conservation? And what are the capabilities, and specifically also, what are the limitations? Now I'll add kind of the second part into this. What are the limitations, and what cutting edge technologies that this is a battle, so battle with poachers, technologies and systems that are out there operational in other sectors. How can we use those, or do you see applying those would help rhino poaching? What would be needed to make that happen?
Well, first, thank you for that good question. It ties in well with everything. So to kind of come in after Will with the same comment, structure of what's going on, we are always trying to be as careful as possible with funding. And technology is usually quite expensive, but if it is something that can gain us more time and save more resources, that's one of the biggest facts, the successes of technology applications in conservation. When we can meet that ground where it is saving us fuel, labor, transportation, everything in between, and we're getting something out of it that is reducing the cost and enhancing the biodiversity monitoring, the wildlife protection, and the data that we need to be submitting for grants and or anything along the rest of the chain. So there are several pieces of technology that are really kind of helping us now. We finally have access to a platform called Earth Ranger that is a smart parks style system that basically, if you were to have watched one of the last Jurassic Park movies, it's very similar to that. It shows you your reserve in a live scale, and it has your resources and assets with indicators, trackers, and signals. So you have things like fence line detection going on if there's a disturbance. You have little receptors that you can put on fuel tanks out in the middle of the bush where that might be a refuel spot or power lines or the rangers themselves. And then, of course, the rhinos. So you have key species that we are monitoring. You don't need to put a collar on every single animal in a reserve, specifically with how those animals interact in the environment. So when you put an AI collar that communicates with the smart system through Earth Ranger, you can create a data map of where the rhinos are, where they like to be, and then choose based on the time of the month, the weather, and the temperature so that you can make the best moves for your wildlife protection-based activities. So to give that into scale, poachers aren't coming in, generally speaking, right now, in the middle of the day to open fire on rhinos, but they may sneak in the morning or in the late afternoon between game drives, hide, and then take a shot on a rhino sometime between 2 and 4 a.m. when the moon has either crested out or there's cloud cover or there's wind and rain. So with that simple calculation, we don't want rangers sitting in the middle of the bush by a rhino at 12 a.m. We want them looking in a different area. And then you can take that data set, and we already do this pre-technology, but now we have refined data with a lot of different points to make the teams surgically accurate, as well as we can use things in that same AI to put in where the incursions were, where the arrests were, where the incidents were, and create a threat risk area. So that, again, based on time, weather, animal, and location for that specific reserve, you can put your team in the right spots. When it comes to managing the actual animals themselves, this is going to be used on lions and elephants as well, giraffe. And all of this also helps you from going out and physically tracking them, spending the time, the labor hours, the fuel, and all those other things that come along with just the monitoring scientific aspect. So that enhances both worlds, the ecology and the wildlife protection. At the same time, we're utilizing things like thermal imagery with drones. They're high-end commercial market drones, so your regular DJI, as well as things like license plate scanners, or what we call LPR, license plate readers, that are on roads and highways that are scanning the syndicate vehicles and pinging us and letting us know who's in transit where. And then we have things like camera traps that have AI technology to scan a human silhouette, send an alert at a certain level, which then messages the reserve manager and APU manager, so that you can save time and have a AI version of a human basically out monitoring a high risk or high transit area where poachers may be coming and going. Again, saving time and fuel, ranger labor, and making sure you're spending the most time physically possible on the actual risk areas for each species. The limitations really do come back into two main things. Again, is funding. You'll hear that from us, unfortunately, all the time. Technology is very expensive. Some of these platforms are very costly to put in. And then at the same time, the conditions of the elements are always going to be hard on technology. These are very remote places. So you have to start from scratch, usually setting up cell towers and internet, and or working on LoRa, so long range frequencies. It's old tech with new tech AI integration. And then finally, the major crux that we all are stuck with is battery life and power. So how do you make these things work, and how long can they last? But some of the new collars that SP Leroux did, actually have a solar panel on the collars. So these things are really starting to change the game for everybody. Getting those things to hit reception in these high terrain and undulating map terrain, if you will, is difficult. So you don't always have the most accurate, immediate information, but we have very strong data sets now. So that's a good coordination of what tech is being utilized in rhino conservation. There are other techs being used in some of the higher range counter wildlife trafficking investigations, police investigations, stuff like that. I can't really talk about those too much, but those are also things that are coming from military and police forces around the world, that some are getting integrated into the crossover of the wildlife crime side that are helping.
Excellent information. Thank you very much, Mike. And that was, you brought up in the last part something that I was thinking about. I was curious, and I was going to ask you whether being able to use the drones, the technologies that are deployed out within the military, within the Department of Defense, whether we could use those, you could use those in your fight against the rhino poaching, where it is a war against criminals. And why not be able to reapply what's already been done, what is successfully implemented in other form of war?
Yeah. So one of the things with the drones in particular that is on the wish list for many areas is the technology to identify a drone that is not yours and to hijack that. Because the syndicates are using drones, they're using high-level drones, so they have expensive equipment on them, and we can't trace the user, we can't track it down, and rarely can we capture that drone. So something like what an airport would use to basically keep a regular user's drone out of the fly space is something like an Aero Shield, Aero Dome. Those are things that we would like to implement, as well as the same system that is utilized. There's a step further than that, which is being able to trace the user who's flying that drone and hijack the controls of that drone and down it so that you can actually use it for a prosecution. So that kind of tethers in, but that price tag sits at, I think, $35K for an area of just one reserve. And there's, in the Eastern Cape alone, there's over 20. So we have to look at smarter solutions in that situation, because that becomes really expensive, and it starts to move away from its cost efficiency compared to resources on the ground, like the rangers and community engagement and rewilding aspects.
Thank you, Mike, for the information. Yes, the funding is just such a big part of it. Part of this fight. Thank you. And my next question is for Ralph. Ralph, you mentioned legal frameworks. As far as the rhino, now what do we need to secure legal rights for rhinos? What resources and partnerships are necessary to expedite the process? And so I'll kind of combine my second question with this as well. And how long, what's the time frame, the timeline that you foresee until the implementation of your model to show the tangible results as far as reducing criminal activities?
So in terms of legal rights or personhood, consulting legal minds, that's what I was doing when I was developing this idea. In the case of for Costa Rica, it was the bees, because the bees are in Costa Rica, so the government itself could take that decision and basically confer personhood. It could take an act from the parliament or whatever, but it's really the country that feels those bees are a national treasure for us. So we're just going to confer personhood. Now, the personhood, the importance of the personhood from a practical point of view, what it does, it endows the recipient with rights. and it demands responsibilities from everybody else. So suddenly we have responsibilities towards the bees. If there's any injury, any harm, there's legal ramifications and there are financial ramifications. This is where my work comes in, because you see, when you want to get the markets to invest, and this is, I'm not talking about philanthropy, I'm not talking about altruism, I'm talking about people coming in to invest in this proposition. The first question we're going to ask you, who is looking after, is the rhino, let's take the rhino for example, is it an asset of the country, or is it an asset of the community? And this is a decision that it changes from one place to another. For example, I work in the Bahamas. I work on seagrass, selling the carbon of the seagrass of the Bahamas. Bahamas is sitting on 30% of the world mass of seagrass. That is worth about $170 billion. Imagine. So when we met with the premier and with the government, first question I asked was, who can speak on behalf of the seagrass? And what the government had already passed a law that says anything that is green or blue, what the sale of the carbon belongs to the government. So why is that important? Because whoever is buying the carbon credits can figure out, okay, that's my counterpart. That's where the personhood from a practical point of view comes in. It creates so if it's a person, if the rhino is a person, then he or she, the rhino, is endowed with rights, and therefore we have responsibilities towards it. Now, why is the responsibilities important? Because if there's harm, then there's going to be legal ramifications, but you already have that. You already have laws which says you shouldn't kill the rhino, we're going to come after you. Obviously, that's not enough. The financial side is important, because this is where it becomes a sort of a market. The market can help you out, in the sense that if let's say, for example, I'm working with the Māori in the Pacific on the whales. If you say, well, if you kill that whale in my water, by the way, the Māori people have dominion over 2.2 million square kilometers of ocean. So let's say we can find out that using Mike's technology, we can detect that you hit the whale. We're going to come after you with, what is the value of that whale? Well, Ralph published a paper with his colleagues saying the value of a whale, lifetime earnings of a whale from just carbon alone, is $3 million. So the penalty is going to be $3 million. See, that's where everything changes. Why is that? Because first of all, that $3 million, suddenly the captain of the ship is worried. I don't want to hit the whale, because I'm going to have to pay $3 million to whoever is in charge of looking after the whale. Now let's go back to the rhino. For us, so the personhood can be an act. If the rhinos, I know very little, I apologize. I know more about elephants than about rhinos. But if they move within a country, then they would be the asset of the country. It's a no-brainer. It could be the government that says anything related to the rhino, we have to deal with it. Or if it is on a land that's owned by indigenous people, as in the case of the Māori in the Pacific, then the indigenous people would say this creature belongs to us. Now, it could belong to us as an asset, or it could belong to us as a person. If it's a person, then it's a member of the tribe. You see, so you hurt them, you hurt the rhino, you're hurting us. So we're going to come after you legally and financially. Now, why is that again important? Because once you endow it with the legal rights of nature or personhood or an asset, the markets take you seriously. And there, once something is an asset and its services enter your balance sheet, then you can insure it, because insurance companies would come into this. That's the whole idea. Now, if in the case of the elephants, we wanted to sell the biodiversity credits of the elephants. So suddenly, if you're selling it to Microsoft, Microsoft is going to say, oh, I'm getting carbon that is sequestered due to the action of the elephants. I'm also getting biodiversity credits because it's fauna and flora interacting with each other and creating other benefits. So all of these things are valuable to Microsoft. Why is that? Because if you talk to sustainability officers of large corporations, they are all looking at the narrative they want to build for their institution. The market, the carbon market has morphed now, has progressed beyond the carbon credits to biodiversity credits to cultural credits. So if we could map, and I'm asking here, Dr. Fowlds and Mike, you guys are the experts, if we know what the ecosystem services are of the rhinos, and if those ecosystem services could be valued, right, from a market perspective, then we can build the financing tool that would bring in companies that want to be part of that story, that our money is not only generating carbon, maybe rhinos don't generate carbon, but they're creating other kinds of ecosystem services that would be valuable to those companies. What does Microsoft get from putting on their website that they're investing in the elephants? This was the proposition to Lee back then, that we're investing in the elephants, we're getting our carbon credits, we're getting biodiversity credits, we're getting cultural credits, so we're hitting our SDGs. This is incredibly valuable in monetary terms to companies. So, but the pillar for me to do my work, I need the science. What does the science tell me about what are the ecosystem services that the rhino provides? And this is, I need guidance from the scientists there. What is it that they do? Then what I would do is I would take that ecosystem services and see whether I can map it to market prices, to market valuation. It's important to underscore market, because if you want to talk to the markets, you have to use their language, their techniques. Otherwise, they don't take us seriously. We focus on carbon not because I'm enamored with carbon, it's because there's a carbon price. There's a carbon market already. The price is dictated by the market. I don't make up that price. All I had to do was calculate, and that comes from Fabio Berzaghi's work, the case of the elephants, how much carbon is being sequestered due to the work of the elephants, you see? So, and I have a price of carbon, so I multiply price by quantity, and I get a value. But once you have that, and you decide, and you figure out the provenance or the legal framing, you're off. You can then build the whole mechanism around it. Your question to me was, how fast can we do this? That really depends on, I mean, I know very little about South Africa. I don't know whether there's a proclivity to even endow the rhinos with personhood or legal rights, or simply the government says, anything related to the rhinos belong to us. That would be enough for the markets. The next thing we would need is, what does the science tell us about the ecosystem services that the rhinos provide? Okay, then once we understand that, then I can start to build the valuation side. Once we have that, then we can go to the markets. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Ralph. It's a matter of the science at this point, focusing on the rhino. It's a matter of the science, the funding for the science. But the other part that you mentioned, also the government, South Africa. Mike and Dr. Fowlds, what do you think of that? Is that something that likely, based on your knowledge and experience, that as far as getting legal rights for the rhino, the governments to acknowledge and keep rhinos protected, is that something that you think could happen within short time?
Let me take a stab at that. So yeah, the critical component here, and Ralph has brought this through very strongly, that if there is a market out there that is willing to pay for ecosystem services like carbon or biodiversity or cultural, so if that market exists out there, it's a critical funding component of what species like rhino need. If you are an owner or a custodian of rhino, it is it's not a money maker, it's a money drainer. You know, you take on decades of responsibility and you pay money in every single month just to have those rhino a part of your world, and that is a heavy burden on rhino custodians at the moment. When we talk about communities, there's no chance that the ownership or the responsibility of species like rhino could ever be transferred to communities unless there's some kind of monetization of that asset that incentivizes communities to do that, because they're poor anyway, and now you're putting an even bigger financial burden on them. So if we could close this gap, this financial gap, it would make a massive difference in our future outlook, and not just the protection, but the socioeconomic benefits that flow from it. The critical missing piece here, as Rob says, is the measurement, the science, as he calls it. So, I believe that technology will play a massive role in maintaining the measurement, but we need research to go out there and decide what we need to measure. What is it that we need to measure? Put the technology in place so that is an ongoing process that maps the process of the species or the ecosystem or whatever it is, so that we can get to biodiversity credits. Biodiversity is diverse, so therefore it's complicated, and we're going to have to define simple metrics that are measurable and put those in place. And to my knowledge, that does not exist beyond carbon at this point. So that is the challenge that I think we have. And certainly my takeaway from tonight is that's one of the buttons that we need to go out there and push.
If I may just interject quickly, we could also bring in investment early on, because we could say, if you were to come in and fund the science, we could create a pilot. You see, if you come in, how wonderful it is for you to come in and fund the science. So let's create it. Actually, that was a proposition that I had made to Lee back then. We called it Sandbox. So you come in and you fund that pilot study, which will track what the rhinos are doing, how they're the delta that they're impacting, and basically companies remember what's really going on, because people forget the macro environment in which we're operating. Regulators, investors, consumers, employees are telling companies, don't just talk to me about carbon, talk to me about a systems approach. This is why when you talk to sustainability officers, they're looking for that narrative that they want to be part of. You see, and so the proposition from the Rhino side would be, if you come with us early on and you invest in this proposition of understanding what do the rhinos do, what are their impact, whatever we find, you could gain from it. It's like coming in early in an investment. We would also need Mike's technology. We would need Mike's human technology as well as the high-tech approach. We need the guards. Everybody would actually have a role to play. Now, finally, so that I learned this from the elephants. I learned this from Ian Redmond and other people. I mean, is that in the case of the elephants, the poachers would ask the villagers where the elephants are. So what this does is generates a proposition for the community that a living rhino is far more valuable than a dead rhino. When I tell you the value of the services, by the way, I'm not talking about the value of an elephant. Elephant is far more valuable than 1.75 million. But all we could do was calculate the value of just carbon that an elephant adds to. So by no means we've figured out the full value of this beautiful creature. Anyway, so what it does is it gives a proposition to communities that a living elephant is far more valuable to you than a dead one. A dead one, the ivory or the tusk fetches 40,000 if it's but a living elephant is worth 1.7. Actually, it's now 4 times as much because the price of carbon keeps going up. So do you change the incentives? Conservation becomes a source of revenue rather than a burden, as Dr. Fowlds is alluding to. This is the power of what you can do when you bring in the market. But keep in mind, we're bringing in the market, but we have our objective already well defined. The asset never changes hands. You're never selling the rhino or the elephants or any of the sort. They are there to roam freely as nature deemed them to do so. This is how you generate the revenue from them, right? I mean, the elephants, for them to generate that carbon in the forest, they have to frolic freely in the forest, not you tie them to a tree, say, now generate it for me. So they have to actually roam freely, right? What Mike's work would be is to track where they are. It could be highly, you know, with trained people, or it could be high tech, could be AI, just to make sure that we have a way of measuring what they're really doing without impinging on their life. You see? But we need the science. I need the science first. Everything we do, what I do is really called science-based finance. I need the science first. It's a pillar of our work. What does the system do? What do whales do? What do elephants do? What do wolves do? What do rhinos do? And then we look through that and we say, okay, these are some of the ecosystem services for which we can map into a market. And sometimes, by the way, some of them, the market is not there, but investors would be willing to do so, would be willing to wait. So we call them sometimes carbon plus plus. We will say, look, we know they have an impact. We don't know how much is that impact, but we know it's not zero. So if you come in early, you may benefit from the upside that is surely going to come when we find. So you take the investor with you as a partner, and then suddenly become like an equity investor, but an equity investor in a living nature, in a living and thriving rhino. How wonderful that would be.
Yes, thank you, Ralph. That would be incredible. And a really good takeaway here is the science to really figure out who are the key players that we need to make this happen, to get the information, the technology, the resources, to get the science part, and also the pilot program. I really love that, the idea of a small pilot to demonstrate the pilot first. Excellent, very nice. Well, I have so many more questions for you all, but we are running out of time. And now it's time for the audience. I see the audience, you've placed some questions in the Q&A box. And we'll go ahead and start with your questions. Mike, feel free to go ahead and select the questions, and we'll get started.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. We can all hear me okay still? Perfect, yeah. Okay, so we have several questions in the queue. First one coming in from Lydia. How was Tandy's breathing affected by the removal of her horn, and how does she learn to compensate? So I'll pitch that to Dr. Fowlds.
Okay, so the breathing, the airway apparatus of Tandy has recovered completely, so her airways are functioning normally. So there's no interference whatsoever from the damage that occurred on the top of her head. So I'm pleased to say that side of her is 100% okay. What we have to be careful with her is because she doesn't have a front horn, and the base of where her front horn was has always remained very soft and fragile. There have been multiple incidences, particularly during lovemaking, when her face has been damaged. So that is a reality, unfortunately, that she's going to have to live with. In subsequent survivor cases that surgeons like Johan Marais and Gerard Steenkamp have had to deal with, we've managed to improve on what we started with Tandy. So we've learned a lot from her, and that is being applied to other rhino.
Thanks, Dr. Fowlds. Okay, we're going to hop through a couple more questions here. So Lydia, again, we have the risk of poaching vary throughout the month depending on the moon and the light emitted. Like, does poaching increase during full moons? Yes, so I'll take this one. We call the full moon phase the poacher's moon, or the poacher's moon week. Because poachers do like to commonly use the light of the moon to get to the spot where they're going to shoot the rhino or get into place, and then they like to make that shot and have a fast exit once that moon is setting in the middle of the night or / early morning. Other things that come in with the risk of poaching throughout the time of the month have to do with weather, things like wind and rain. A lot of poachers do like to utilize that as cover. It's harder to hear gunshots if the wind is up or the rain is coming in heavy. It's also easier for them to cover their tracks when they are dealing in high wind or high rain. So things like that, as well as dry season and wet season, have a big role to play in the density of poaching incidents in certain areas. Waterways are roadways for poachers to follow, and they're risk points because all animals have to go to those water bodies, whether it's a small pond or a lake or a river or a stream. Those are starting points. So within dry season or wet season, dry season, the foliage is dying back, so the animals are more visible. The water is more condensed, so the animals are more condensed. So the risk is heightened around these key moments of things like a poacher's moon. All right, I'm gonna hop. Will, do you have anything to add to that? Anything else you could think of within the risk of the moonlight phase?
Covered.
Covered. All right. There's another good question about how has COVID impacted the conservation of these animals. Will and I have fought through COVID arduously to get back to a norm. Will, I'll let you go from a first person with how tourism died and what that meant for the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak for the private sector because I live in a game reserve and I'm intimately involved with the expenses that come with that and looking after these animals. I can just tell you that when we are up to full speed on our rhino protection, the money we spend on looking after rhino is the same value per year of what that entire herd could be bought or sold for. So, you know, that's how little economic sense our rhino custodianship makes to us at the moment. But that is all funded by tourism, and a little bit of it is funded by philanthropy and donations. And when tourism disappears like it did with COVID, it has an absolutely devastating impact on the funding, which means, you know, we can't employ people, we lose staff. A number of our key staff members have lost faith in the industry because they're not sure when the next pandemic might come along and the next disruption to travel. So they've gone into completely different industries, and we've lost a ton of human resource there. You know, that affects the morale of people because just simple things like having fuel for vehicles or repairing vehicles, or not being able to pay salaries on time, or you know, having to negotiate paying half salaries or quarter salaries. You know, these are all things that we lived with for 2.5 years, and it's taking a long time to piece all of that back together again. Even though tourism is starting to flow, all of us have taken out massive loans to keep our core staff in place, and the recovery phase will be as long as COVID is, you know, even after tourism bounces back. So bottom line is our animals are vulnerable, and we've had to rely even more so on the philanthropic sector of society to keep us going, and some very generous people out there. But, you know, as Ralph says, if our financial flows could be more consistent and not dependent on travel, it does alleviate the erratic nature of tourism. I do not believe our conservation model is sustainable at this stage because we are so dependent on international travel.
Thanks, Dr.
Indeed.
Fowlds.
Indeed, if I may say, the interesting part of bringing this kind of a market for ecosystem services, you know, you have cash flows from tourism, you have cash flows from philanthropy, and this is another source. But the interesting part about this source, it's not cyclical. You know, if we have another recession, tourists may not come, even if there's no new cases of COVID. God forbid, if there's another COVID, irrespective, this source of tourism, this source of revenue will continue to come in because we are fighting climate change. We are fighting for the health of nature. So that source of revenue will continue to come. That's why we refer to it as acyclical. It just diversifies our revenue model. It sits alongside other types. It also allows us to think more carefully about what kind of tourism we want to have. Maybe, I don't know what it is for the rhino, but in other places, for example, in the, you know, Bahamas or Cayman Islands, where you have volume tourism, and that has a huge impact on nature itself. You can use the revenue from ecosystem services to substitute out volume tourism, replace it with more higher value tourism, where you have fewer tourism, fewer tourists, which have, or ecotourism, something that allows to reduce the impact of having, more tourists showing up on nature itself that we're trying to protect.
Great points. So I'm going to go into the next question. We'll do a couple more. For anybody who has been wondering where these questions are coming from, they're just comments dropped in the thread. So if there's one you really want to get answered, feel free to throw that into that comment thread. This question bounces off the last statements in details. What can we do as individuals to quicken up the acceptance of Ralph's investment and financial proposition so it becomes accepted and taken up globally and the model adopted for more for wildlife species and ecosystems? Nature needs a seat on every board of, I think, on corporates, government, and organizations across the world. Ralph, what do you think about that as a whole right now?
Let me tell you what I did. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the UN Climate Week, and I was with the Māori. I was lucky to be on stage with the Māori delegation, and I found out that the Māori king, and the Māori leadership had decided to confer personhood on the whale, and they were asking the world to actually, help in that fashion, to sign up, to push for personhood on the whale. And the reason they needed the world is because, remember, most whales are migratory. So they belong to all of us in a sense. So you need personhood in every country. So they're asking everybody. So I was standing on stage and I thought, you know what? Why don't we declare the whales ocean ambassadors to the UN? Right? The whale is a keystone species. So big reason, because if you confer personhood on the whale suddenly they have rights. That's what's so important. And we have responsibilities toward them. This is how we can speed up, Mike, some of these issues. Now, once we do that, the markets wake up and say, oh, there's a person or there's an asset. Hey, that didn't exist before. There was just a rhino. Yeah, a beautiful animal we know nothing about. But now we have an incentive to kind of provide services for it. This is where it changes from the perspective of pure investment approach. It suddenly becomes an asset, meaning it has value. I can insure it. Insurance companies may decide to insure the rhino. If she's a person, she can be insured, just like you and I have life insurance. They will have a life insurance. There are other ancillary services that you can build around. Now, what can we do as individuals? We could push if there's an effort to confer personhood on the rhino. People could sign up to that effort, and we get enough signatures, then people will start to take take that effort seriously. That's one. I know that's happening in the case of the whale. For example, there's a global push now to confer personhood. We could do the same thing with the rhino. Because already, if you talk to people in ecocide, people on the rights of nature, they'll tell you there's tremendous grassroots efforts there. But there's another thing that we could do. Rather than wait for Microsoft or Google to invest, we ourselves could invest. Individuals could invest. So we could do the proposition, right? We can do crowdfunding, where we as individuals could say, you know what, I want to offset my carbon footprint, so I am going to invest in a rhino. But remember what you're really doing. You're investing in a fund that looks after the rhino in perpetuity. And what that fund will do is say, okay, you have now a share in that fund, and that fund has, it's producing carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and those are invested and you get a return on it. So individuals could become equity holders in nature, in the rhino's wealth and health. And both the rhino benefits and people feel good, and they get something also in return if they so choose.
Thanks, Ralph. Appreciate that. I think that's a good that's a good way to put the momentum out there. I think one of the other things that tends to get people in the size and scale of this is we need to work where there's the most progress possible first and build blocks of successful progress instead of tackling the whole picture, because this is a multinational huge expanse of territories and habitats, a good place to start would be, locally in small factors to build successful blocks for regions to then push forward so that you can make progress, show progress, and continue hope, versus throw it too big and go too far and maybe lose the wheels on the bus as you go. This next question is towards Dr. Fowlds. For those who don't know, there was recently a agreement made with John Hume, the previous largest owner of a private rhino population. African Parks has made that purchase, and they're going to be moving those animals out into different park systems over the next several years. This question is, now that it's been decided to move forward with John Hume's rhino population, how do we prevent these tame animals from being easily poached? So, Dr. Fowlds, that's for you.
Yeah, so to their credit, Africa Parks have taken responsibility for 2,000 plus rhino, which means they have to look after them, feed them and keep them secure. So that is the undertaking that Africa Parks is now responsible for, and their security lies in their hands. Like with any sort of previous historical story around rhino, we have found best success in looking after them when we distribute the risk to multiple locations, and that's what they have undertaken to do now, to rewild these animals back out to multiple locations across Africa. That's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of money. And there are also rhino there that have been in that system for 3 generations. So there's some questions around rewilding which will need to be answered. And those animals will have to be almost nursed back into the wild. So yeah, there's a big challenge ahead there. But like I say, to Africa Parks' credit, they've put up their hand where no one else wanted to catch that ball. And I think we'd be good to support them and do whatever we all can to make sure these animals get out there in the wild where they belong, and more importantly, to find ways to sustainably ensure their safety into the future.
Yeah, I agree. So it's a very complex thing. There are a lot of people watching that with close attention, obviously, because of the volume of rhinos. And then there's a lot of logistical problems with moving rhinos and caretaking for rhinos, let alone keeping them safe. So it's a giant cost that African Parks has taken on. By no means is that an easy detail. And then moving them is going to be a big detail as well. Okay, so basically we have most of the questions answered here. There's one last one, which Ralph, you did cover it generally, but we didn't actually ask the question. This is from Lance Wynn. Essentially, it's if a ship captain or owner covers the cost of the whale they've hit, in Ralph's assessment growth model, who is the investment recovered from when an elephant is poached, or rhino in this envisioned model? If I understand correctly, Ralph, you would, in this platform, you'd be working towards making that individual accountable, or that company, as well as an insurance coverage.
Beautiful, exactly. So really, what we're after is the insurance company, because remember what happens. Suppose the captain, suppose we're with the whales at a point where it's understood if the captain were to hit that whale, the penalty is $2 or $3 million. Every ship is insured. The insurer and the reinsurer is going to say, wait a minute, come here. When we insured you, there was no whale in the water that is worth $3 million. So either your premium has to be increased, you see, and or you're going to place a gadget on the bow of the ship that's going to keep you away from hitting that whale. That's what we're after. Exactly what you're doing, Mike, which is on the technology side. We need the technology, and the technology exists. It's just that technologies haven't come in to protect the whales because there was no money in it. So now the insurance company tells the owner of the ship, you're going to have to put a camera, and we have infrared cameras. We have all kinds of technologies now, and I work with some of these people to see what they're doing. That would allow you, the captain, to see that there's a humpback about a mile away from you. so that you can take the right action, either reduce your speed or just 3 degrees to move away from hitting. So in a sense, what you're doing is the insurance company, you're engaging the market now. Now, it doesn't end there, because suppose the owner of that ship says, okay, I will install that device on my ship. If you install that device on your ship, you are now, relative to the insurance company, a much better risk than some other ship or some other owner of another ship that refuses to put that gadget. You're, in the language of risk, you're a lower credit risk now, which means your premium is going to be lower than someone else that refuses to put that gadget on their ship. And the market rewards you for that, in the sense that when you issue your paper, be it debt or equity, your risk premium is going to be lower. So really, it's a way of allowing the market to internalize the benefits from protecting the whales, or be it the rhino. Right now, this conversation doesn't even exist. Today, as I'm talking to you, there's a ship that almost surely hit a whale because they're dying on a regular basis. It will skewer this magnificent creature on its bow, sail into the harbor of Los Angeles, and there is no penalty whatsoever, sadly. Okay? So what you're really doing by saying, if you were to hit that whale or to kill that elephant, there's penalty. Whoever is insuring, in the case of the poachers, you're basically going after whoever is really managing the syndicate that you're referring to. They'll be held liable financially and otherwise, but it will change the model completely, because you have a revenue model. The government now would become far more serious about, protecting those, because it's a revenue model for the government. A living rhino becomes a revenue model, not a cost proposition. Right now, listening to you and Dr. Fowlds, it's all a cost proposition. Conservation is costly. When you start to sell the ecosystem services of the rhinos, right, suddenly it's a revenue proposition. And therefore, the incentives of the government changes 180 degrees. Say, wait a minute, I have an asset that's generating revenue or reducing the cost of conservation on my behalf. So why wouldn't I want to protect it? You see? And if the money trickles to the communities say, why would I want to help in killing that beautiful creature or poaching it? I'm benefiting from it being alive and well. And suddenly the relationship could be like this, it becomes a complementary relationship between a living and thriving rhino and the community. This is what we were after with the elephants, right? And this is the power of empowering the markets to understand the value of a living and thriving rhino, living for itself.
Thanks, Ralph. Dr. Fowlds, if there's any other comments that you want to throw into the mix with everything, I think looking at the time, we're at a good closing point. I just want to say from my side, thank you guys for joining us on the panel. It's always a pleasure to work alongside you all. Azi, thank you for having me. And Will, if you don't have anything else to add, I'll pass it back to Azi.
Yeah, just quickly to answer another part of the second part of Lance's question. By increasing the monetary value of the living animal, there is a legal implication to that, and we have successfully managed to push the envelope on convictions here in the Eastern Cape by charging rhino poachers for conspiracy to poach. In other words, before they've even killed a rhino, we've succeeded in achieving 20-year prison sentences for conspiring to poach. And then by increasing the value of the animal, we could then begin to start putting charges of racketeering against these rhino poachers, which brings far greater sentences to play. So it's another mechanism to increase the risk factor on their side, assuming that our legal system works well. So there's another F.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point.
Thank you very much, Azi. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fowlds. Thank you, Mike, also
You're
for
welcome.
reading. Thank you, Ralph. So that brings us to closing, to the last part of the webinar and the presentation. Thank you very much for all your invaluable insights. I'm really, really excited to see these ideas, these thoughts that we talk about, the next step, to go forward to the next step, to be game-changing for saving rhinos, and to come up with new programs, new partnerships, the science part, as you mentioned, Ralph, the legal side, protecting rhinos in the reserve, the technology side. There's definitely lots of potential for collaboration, and there's hope. There's hope for the rhinos. There's hope for saving rhinos. And I also wanted to mention, you see in this picture, Tandy with her latest calf, baby Zolani, and they're being featured as a quite a large painting, wildlife jewels character animals that to raise awareness for their story and share with people. And they'll be on exhibit at Global Conservation Force upcoming 8th annual gala in San Diego. So a piece of Tandy and Zolani inspiration piece will be there for the first time. It'll be revealed there. And that's all. So I hope that to hear from everyone. Thank you, audience, for attending. Thank you for all of your questions. And I really, really hope within a short time frame to see some new actions and some new programs and results as a result of our discussion.